So evolution doesn't happen to individuals, it happens to populations. And this is because what evolution represents is a change in the frequencies of alleles found at different loci within a individual's over time. And so a given individual at its different genetic loci is going to have a fixed number of alleles. For example, if you have blue eyes, you'll have 2 little b blue eye alleles. If you have brown eyes, you might be a heterozygote. But across a population, there'll be some frequency of blue eye alleles and some frequency of brown eye alleles, for example. And then over time, that frequency might change. So it could start out, say, 50-50, and then over time, for whatever reason, the population might become more blue-eyed. And so it might become 75% blue allele and 25% brown allele. And what you'll be seeing phenotypically is that in the population, a population that is dominated by brown-eyed individuals will over time become more dominated by blue-eyed individuals. Now, this is not a discussion of why the blue allele, as in this example, became more predominant. It's just saying that that change alone represents evolution. And what we have in the study of evolution is something known as Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is, in a sense, a made-up group of criteria, made up in the sense that it's unlikely for all these things to actually happen, that together are a bunch of assumptions that are required in order to have a situation in which a population is not changing genetically, which is to say it's not evolving. And this is considered to be the default assumption in evolutionary biology, that a population is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and therefore it's not evolving. So therefore, the frequency of the alleles that are present in the population, for example, blue alleles versus brown alleles, that frequency is not changing. If they're at 50-50, they're staying at 50-50. If they're at 75-25, they're staying at 75-25. Now, alternatively, you can have violations of the assumptions of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. We'll get to those violations in a second. And in that case, you in fact can have changes in the frequency of alleles over time, in which case we have population genetic change, in which case we have what is known as evolutionary change. Now, what are these violations? These violations of the Hardy-Weinberg assumptions are known as mutation, migration, selection, and also chance events, which gives rise to what's known as genetic drift. There's actually a 5th assumption in there, which we'll get to, called random mating. But for the moment, we don't need to worry about that. But these are the biggies that we'll spend some time concentrating on. So the Hardy-Weinberg assumptions is that there's no mutation, there's no migration. We'll get to what migration is in a second. There's no selection, no natural selection, and there's no chance events, no genetic drift. You get the lack of chance events in part by having population sizes that are very, very large. There are populations, in fact, there are many populations out there that really are not changing all that much over time. So you might assume that, in fact, therefore, they're displaying this Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, that, in fact, there is no mutation, no migration, no selection, or no chance events. But that's just not true. I mean, it is really fanciful to have a situation where all of these things are not present. And instead, what you tend to have in these populations is selection for whatever the dominant types are, which is basically a way of saying, it's called stabilizing selection. It's basically a way of saying that there's a lot of populations out there that are perfectly happy in the situation that they're in. They're well adapted to their environments, and evolution simply assures, natural selection simply assures that those alleles that contribute to the success of that population simply remain in that population over time. So there's a lot of populations that, in fact, sort of seemingly display a lack of population genetic change over time. But it's probably not because they're strictly in a Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, but instead that the dominant type in that population is simply pretty good at what it does and therefore is not being replaced by other types.